I'm here with Conor Bronsdon at DPE Summit 2023. So excited to have you here. We last spoke together on the Dev Interrupted podcast, the DevOps Enterprise Summit, and things have changed and things have not changed since then too.
It's almost a year now. It's been really exciting to see how the industry has adjusted over the last year. And super stoked to be talking with you again, Justin.
Oh, this is always so great, and it's an exciting time now. And I think we're both feeling a lot of validation, seeing sort of the market catch up. Everybody wants to talk about this right now, right?
Yeah.
So speaking of, this little group called McKinsey had a few things to say about this subject that we were just riffing on a little bit pre-interview here. Catch us up. Talk us about it a little bit. What are you thinking about this?
So this is a really interesting one. I know Justin and I both have a lot of thoughts on it. My main takeaway is that it's great that companies like McKinsey are caring about the space. As Justin mentioned, I think we've been shouting from the rooftops for a couple of years now that this is something we need to talk about. Engineering metrics matter, developer productivity matters. And so it's a validation effect, but it's also something where we see where these companies are so new to the space and maybe don't have the technical background that we want them to have. So they're not actually considering what the developer experience is going to be like when they implement these systems. And we need to make sure that we're focusing on a team-first perspective that's actually positive for developers, built by developers in a way that makes sense for actually delivering for the business, but also makes the teams that these metrics are applied to work better. And I think we would both say, if we look at that McKinsey framework, they're not thinking about that. It's not their priority.
No, I think that's kind of exactly what we were both discussing. That's what's missing here, ironically, has been sort of what's been the most obvious focus for us, which is, well, what does this mean from a human outcome perspective, right? Like when we actually do these things, when we check these boxes, what should we look for next, right? So maybe put yourself in the shoes a little bit. You're writing this study. I mean, it wasn't all bad, right? There were a lot of observations here that were correct, and that I think we're actually, providing some pretty good insight. But you get the opportunity to change just a couple of these things. You get the opportunity to tweak some of this outcome to something that matches the more human story that we know to be. What's it going to be? What does that look like?
Well, I think the obvious straw man is an over focus on individual metrics. So like the one we always talk about is lines of code, right? Where too many companies have made layoff decisions or measure developers on lines of code delivered. Yet anyone who actually works in the industry knows that this is not a real metric as far as what's actually happening with productivity, and it's easily gameable. We want to make sure these are metrics that actually are drawn through towards impact and drawn through towards whether this person is a good team member. And actually, there's a great talk on this earlier today at DPE Summit, where we are with Lauren from Spotify. Talked about how these leading metrics that people try to over-optimize on sometimes for individuals become gamed so easily. And that's why I personally think, and Linear View's research shows, that we need to be focusing on these team metrics so that we can actually make positive impacts on the industry. And I think some Gradle talks a lot about that as well.
We do, because I think there's a pragmatism there. First of all, Spotify, absolute luminaries in this space, right? I mean, what they've been able to do with Backspace, and the way they think about these kinds of things, and then understand, I think, something that you and I talked about, I believe, in the last interview, which was the importance of applying Goodhart's law to these metrics, where it's like the reason that the ability to game one of these metrics matters is goes back to the original example of Goodhart, which was always like, okay, well, what is your target? I need you to make 1,000 nails for me. Okay, great. I will make you 1,000 of the cheapest, lightest, least resilient nails possible. I need 10 pounds worth of nails from you. Great. Here is one 10-pound nail. Right? So it's like we're able to meet whereas I think what's so great about what you're describing and the way that this thinking about is that no, there's not one metric. It's really several metrics, I think, operating in tension together, where even you may tweak one thing over here and be expecting some outcome over here that may even be negative, but you've then made the decision, like this trade-off is worth it for you. Tell me about what a couple of these things are, some of these human outcomes that you would expect to see.
Sure, so something we've talked about before when Justin was kind enough to appear previously on our Dev Interrupted podcast, and other times that he and I have had conversations. Obviously, local build time is a really important one. Gradle's very on top of that. Another one that we look at a lot is PR workflows. So is your code actually getting committed regularly? Are PRs lingering? And there's research that shows that when code reviews move faster, so does the entire engineering org's productivity. I mean, it's an obvious thing, right? If you're able to get your work committed faster and move it forward, you have less context switching, you have more opportunities to make sure you're delivering value. And these are the kind of things we should be optimizing for that have positive leading and lagging indicators around them, instead of saying, okay, what's happening with this one individual? These are team metrics that can help the entire team's workflow. And I think that's where it's really important that our industry is part of shaping this conversation. And we can't leave it up to people like McKinsey, who may or may not be diving in as deep as we'd like them to. And like I said, I don't want to completely call BS on it. Like some of the stuff they had in there was great. I just think that there's improvements we made that framework. And I'm really glad we're having these conversations here at DPE Summit, whether it's hearing from folks like Uber, like we did earlier with a fantastic talk about how they're applying developer productivity metrics, or talking to Justin here today.
No, you brought up lines of code earlier, and I think it's just one that's although there were, I think we all who think about this stuff, we have a few different points that we were able to sort of maybe specifically glom onto, shall we say, about this study. But lines of code seems to be the one that causes sort of the most contention, because I think we all, that's like the no-brainer that we all get in the 101. It's like, no, you can't measure productivity with lines of code. And then next is like story points, right? It's like you can't have all of these things together. And there's a fluidity that has to be kept in mind here too. Like, I do come from a time writing enterprise code in the late 90s and early 2000s where it was bragging rights to come in the Monday and be like, oh, I cranked out 1,000 lines of code, 100,000 lines of code over the weekend. I was so productive. Yeah. But with the landscape shifting that way, it was like, okay, well, what does that 100,000 lines of code even do? Right.
Absolutely. I think broadly we're thinking a lot more now about extensibility of our apps, right? So if we build a framework, and to your point, maybe we use 10,000 lines of code to develop an app. If that app is no longer efficient in 2-3 years down the line, and there's only one person who knows how to maintain it because they built the thing, that is a problem for future teams. If that person leaves, suddenly you have a problem because people have to untangle what's happening. So simplification is actually a really positive thing when it comes to development. And I'm not saying anything revolutionary, but I think these kind of things get ignored in a lot of these discussions, and we tend to focus on things that are easier for us to measure instead of thinking about, okay, what's the outcome we want to see, and how are we actually going to operationalize these metrics and apply these in a way that are actually going to have a positive outcome. And that comes back to that developer experience thing we talked about. Is, it's so important today that your teams have an opportunity to make an impact and feel that impact, because you don't want to be in a world where your pull request is lingering for weeks or months. Like, you want to actually see your code be committed and make a positive impact. And that's such a valuable thing for developers to have, let alone you don't want them to be pulled out of their workflow or waiting a lot of time for tests. Like, these are the things that make it really easy for a developer to say, hey, I want to go work somewhere else. Like, why am I doing this?
Which increasingly, as we know, have more and more, options available to them to do so. So we've talked a lot about the importance from a retention, talent acquisition standpoint about where this. Let me ask you another kind of question. So, saying that this McKinsey study now exists, and we can kind of look at some of the subjects in there, some of the points that they have brought up, and without getting staying civil in our discourse and talking about this. What it's such an important time for this. I think you and I are seeing the industry and the messaging in general, thought leadership, everybody wants to talk about this now, which makes it an important time, but also a precarious time. Yes. Because right now is when we can really screw up the messaging, right now is where we can really scale like the wrong idea. So tell me, what led us to this, where this obviously huge, well-respected organization with a ton of experience and a very wide view, what's wrong with, for lack of a better place to point the blame, what's wrong with people like us out there trying to pioneer this messaging that some of these points were so, I would say, sort of egregiously lost? What could we have done more to raise more awareness of the right things to pay attention to?
That's a really interesting question. I think the kind of thing we're doing today, having these conversations, is an important first step. But the honest answer is that McKinsey is responding to the same market forces that we're seeing, which is a lot of enterprise interest, a lot of demand from major corporations. And when you look at a company that is, large scale, let's say they're a public company, thousands of developers, that company has different concerns than a smaller startup or scale-up. They have different market forces playing on them. They are usually optimizing for shareholders. And I personally feel that the decision-making flows down from the very top, the executive levels. And we see that impact all the way down into engineering orgs, where it's more of a push to capture value versus create net value. And I think that changed, and it's a natural change for some companies, right? They instead of being on major growth mode, they're saying, hey, I'm now in I need to hit a certain amount of revenue per quarter, and that's what the street's going to care about. I think that really trickles down throughout the company. To use an example, I'm not trying to. Google's a partner of ours. We're working with them on the Sears Door report. We're very excited about it. But at the same time, I think no one's going to deny that Google 10 years ago is probably a little more innovative, and Google 20 years ago is definitely more innovative than Google today. And part of that is because they are now in a value capture stage where they have this massive, I'll call it a monopoly, even though their lawyers will disagree with me, around internet ad sales. And they're saying, hey, how do we capture value from this? And yeah, they're still building new products, but the important thing is protecting this massive advantage where they realize all their value as a company. And when they're doing that, they are not spending their time on things that flow down to developers and actually cause innovation. And so developers' incentives and engineering executives' incentives, which then flow down to the devs, becomes, hey, let me make this thing that we already do well a little bit better instead of building something that new. And I think what McKinsey hears from is they hear from these giant corporations. They think about, okay, well, I need to optimize the internal infrastructure at Netflix or Google, these major corporations. Whereas a lot of smaller companies, and Gradle's been around for a while, but it's still a small company. And it's harder for them to hear us because that's not where they're realizing the value. They're realizing the value of these massive companies, and the massive companies are responding to market forces from Wall Street more than they're responding to the actual needs of their customers sometimes. Not always true, but often, a startup will be trying to say, hey, how do I find product market fit? Whereas Google's like, we found product market fit. We got to sell more.
So that's I think a really astute and also very comprehensive observation, because it sort of has me thinking what have we talked about? What do we want to see? Why are we out here pounding the pavement?
What are the incentives?
We want to see commoditization of this, ideally, right? When that happened with DevOps, we saw new vendors enter the space. Yeah. We saw a whole new economy, but ultimately what we really saw was benefits offered to software organizations, right? We saw, okay, these practices were now more accessible to not just Bay Area companies, and it improved the lives of their developers and ultimately the way that they were able to do business. But is there an irony in play now that part of this commoditization, part of following the value, so to speak, that you put it, now actually then takes us away from the creative thinking about solving these interesting niche problems and more into the quote unquote boring problem of solving these issues at scale?
Honestly, I think you're spot on. I think that's absolutely part of what we're seeing here. And I mean, if we talk about the incentives, we were talking a little earlier about the incentive to gamify, right? If I'm being applied individual metrics, I will likely game them. I can respond to those different ways. I'm going to create that 10-pound nail. And I think the McKinsey structure is responding to those same incentives. And their incentives are not, hey, let's help small startups. Their incentives are major corporations that can afford our contracts. These are the folks we want to work with. This is where we're getting the most value. And that is a different paradigm than I think what a lot of engineers want to think about, which is innovation and what's the next new cool thing I can build. And so, yeah, I think you're spot on.
That's in the end, that probably is good news, right? I mean, we know that things probably make the most impact when they're boring.
I mean, to your point,
right?
It means that we're headed towards commoditization and people caring, which is a great sign, but it's also a risk.
It's what we always wanted.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
So, all right.
Well, we wanted. It's full scary. Yeah.
So we're kind of moving to the close here a little bit. Maybe you can tell me. So kind of given the landscape of where we are today, right? And we see this kind of commoditization. We see all these changes. We see larger players kind of coming in. What is the one new behavior that you would like to enable in people that you come across? And not to the point of, oh, I really like to see this. I'm going to make it more visceral. What frustrates you that people aren't doing that you want them to do? And then the last, to round that question out, how can people find you and talk to you about this? Okay,
so this is actually really timely. We are releasing data next week around industry benchmarks. We studied several thousand engineering teams, I think 3.5 million commits, and we're saying, hey, what is happening within these teams? What are the key benchmarks for them? Where do they see success? And we've broken those teams down by industry, by team size, and we'll be releasing that data actually this coming Tuesday, right kind of in the midst of this furious debate, because the thing that I would say is I want us to be benchmarking as an industry. I want us to all have access to what are our metrics, what are our DORA metrics, what are our space metrics. And I think that commoditization you brought up is really crucial for us as an industry. But beyond that, I want us to be benchmarking across the industry and understanding, okay, maybe the benchmark for an enterprise isn't right for my company because we're 200 dev shop, or maybe I'm a 5,000 dev shop and I really shouldn't be applying the same metrics and the same benchmarking of those metrics as 250 dev shop. These are all things that can be customized, but in order to do that, we all need access to the information to make decisions. And that information shouldn't be at an individual level. It should be about what's happening with other teams across the industry. And we're really excited to release that report. You can find it at lineard.io/benchmarks. A lot more information. It'll be live officially on Tuesday, the 26th of September. And it's great timing. I think to your point, like there's a lot of interest in the industry right now. We're really excited to kind of take this second step. It's our second yearly release of it. And I don't know, I'd love to chat with you, whether continue on this call or later, about what can we do next? Like how can we partner with you to keep bringing that industry data out? Because I think it's such an important thing for us to do as partners in the industry. Of how can we make sure that our voice is the voice that's leading this commoditization effort instead of the McKinseys of the world.
You couldn't have said it more perfect. I couldn't have said it more, but that's great. How do we make sure that we stay at the front of this discussion? And I think we keep having talks like this. Now, I hate to say it, unfortunately, September 26th is when the newest downloadable content for Cyberpunk drops, Phantom Liberty. So unfortunately, I will not be able to read that. No,
that's super fair.
No, very excited to see that report drop at Linear B on the 26th. Really excited to read that, and certainly it's always such a pleasure talking to you, Conor.
Thanks for having me on, Justin.
Really great to have you here, and enjoy the rest of the show, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, my pleasure.